Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a good break. I'd like to continue with the introduction for the next session, which is the power of indigenous cosmopolitanism, polyphonic encounters, and solidarities. I'm Lina Vincent, and even though I am an art historian and curator, I like to say that I'm a mediator and a participant, perhaps, in this larger discussion that we are having today. And I've had the opportunity to work with and be part of lots of programs in the last 2 decades that have brought the urban and rural together and what is in between in many ways. So I'd like to now introduce the panel itself. The more than 80 million Adivasi people that currently live within the nation-state borders of India constitute almost 20% of the global indigenous population. The latter is itself a planetary force, almost 480 million in size. So a key part of this highly diverse and complex planetary community, Adivasi peoples are holders of time-tested and ever-adaptive knowledges that elevate collective living. This session speaks of and addresses the cosmopolitan presence of Adivasi practices and the power of their voices to address the concerns of this world, the wider world. From this premise, it also explores the local and transnational friendships and solidarities across indigenous communities, and together with non-indigenous practitioners like many of us that have characterized the last decades of these practices. I'll briefly introduce our incredible panel today, and I think here I would just like to take a moment to say that we are all very privileged to be in a peaceful cultural space exchanging these discussions, while in other parts of the world people are not so privileged, and there is violence and there is tension and there are many different things to think about. So for me as well, I find myself in a beautifully privileged position with this wonderful panel here, whom I have admired and had the opportunity to work with as well at certain points. To begin with, Chaitanya Sambrani is an art historian and curator interested in questions of nationhood, tradition, belonging, and marginality, primarily in the South and Southeast Asia. He is currently Associate Professor at the Australian National University, Canberra, where he teaches courses on Asian modernisms and contemporary art and on curatorial practice. I will be introducing everyone, and then I'll open the stage to you. Sorry? It's just... Sorry. Oh, this one. All right. Kamayani Sharma is a writer, podcaster, and translator, formerly a text editor with Art India and researcher with Sarai CSDS. She develops and manages the audio program for Sharjah Art Foundation and founded Art Alap, South Asia's first independent visual culture podcast. Sharma contributes critical and creative writing to publications worldwide. Venkat Raman Singh Shyam belongs to the tradition of the Pardhan Gond art inaugurated by the legendary Jangar Singh Shyam, his uncle. After apprenticing with Jangad in the 1990s, Venkat worked on a range of jobs that included even house painting, screen printing, and signboard painting. He was also fortunate to be guided by the pioneering Jagdish Swaminathan. Since Jangad's death in 2002, Venkat has pursued a full-time career in art. Santosh Kumar Das is a well-known Mithila artist. He has exhibited his works at BHU, Devi Art Foundation, India Habitat Center, and held a retrospective show in San Francisco, West Australia, and in the US. He paints remotely in his village of Ranti, teaches the young generation, and is a great inspiration to many. In 2017, his autobiographical book was published by Tara Books, and in 2019, his solo exhibition, Rerooted Realities, was curated by Catherine Myers. And finally, Khushboo Jain is an independent curator, researcher, and writer based in India. Her practice engages South Asian and indigenous visual languages, from contemporary miniatures to Tibetan influences and Tantra, with a focus on decolonizing these forms and recontextualizing them within contemporary discourse. With that, I welcome the panel, and Chaitanya, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lina. And special thanks to the team at TAKE, Bhavna and colleagues, and to Katya and to Artshila for organizing and facilitating this gathering of minds. I've titled this presentation, Speaking to the World, Indigeneity and Polyphony. To begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that I have now, this month actually, spent nearly half of my life living in Canberra, Australia, where I'm privileged to live and work on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. It's an exceptionally beautiful and rich part of the world, and it is a great privilege to live and work there. So I want to start by paying respects to the country on which I have lived these last 27 years. And to figure, as a way of prefacing this presentation, a couple of illustrations which speak to polyphony. These are two versions of a language map of Australia, issued in 1996 by the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, IATSIS, which is a federal government body. On your left is a graphic visualization by David Foster, and on the right is a painting, oil on canvas, by Daniel Boyd, who is a contemporary artist of Kuchila, Gangalu, Yukuyalanji, Jagara, Wangeribura and Banjalung ancestry. It's called Treasure Island, taking its cue from the eponymous book by Robert Louis Stevenson. And it is this language map of Australia. At the time of invasion or settlement at the end of the 18th century, Australia was home to about 400 language groups. As the work of contemporary artists, Indigenous artists, First Nations artists in Australia has shown us, that task of restoring that polyphony remains incomplete, and it remains a task accompanied by substantial questions which the Australian nation state has not been able to address successfully. On August 9th, just a week and a bit ago, we celebrated the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. This day is not officially observed in this country, in India, even though, as Lina just told us, this country actually hosts the world's largest population of contemporary indigenous individuals. In the last decade or so, we have seen the beginnings of a long overdue correction in the global art world, greater attention being paid, by no means with equal rigor everywhere, to questions of privilege, representation, restitution, and inevitably of belonging. This country, India, has a peculiar position with regard to the question of indigeneity. The Constitution recognizes 700 plus groups which are categorized as scheduled tribes, and yet the word indigenous is not officially used in this country because the presumption is that everyone is indigenous. And so that language of indigeneity does not sit very easily in this country and in other countries in South and Southeast Asia, and it's worthwhile to think about it, I think, carefully. Within the contemporary art world that all of us are part of, there are structures of representation and participation which in India and other like countries in other parts of Asia rely on very clearly demarcated striations and hierarchies. These date back in the Indian case at least to the foundation of the Bombay Art Society in the 1880s. Followed by various other institutional frameworks which segregated modern art, tribal art, folk art, traditional art into compartments that were not easily crossed. There have been exceptions, of course, and very important ones. Some of these have come out of Shantiniketan, some have come out of Baroda, and very importantly, the work that Mr. Vajpayee referred to earlier with Swaminathan at Rupankar in Bhopal. I also want to note the exhibition India Songs that actually, strangely enough, took place in Sydney in 1993, curated by Victoria Lynn, with Manjeet Bawa and Haku Shah as advisors, which showed contemporary Adivasi art alongside contemporary urban art, but it happened in Sydney, it did not happen in Delhi or in Bombay. So we have this situation where the whole apparatus of belonging and indigeneity is constructed out of a series of structural mythologies, if I could call them that. And on the screen are words that were uttered in a radio broadcast in 1929, as late as 1929, mind you, as late as 1929, by a man called Ronald Shea. And he narrates basically, one of the foundational mythologies of invasion, settlement, and displacement. So a civilization reaching back to a very, very remote past, and if you went all the way down those centuries, you'll notice standing on the high passes of the Hindu Kush, a caravan of men, pioneers of a race from the rugged highlands of Central Asia, fair-skinned, Arya, noble, the branch of the original stock from which we are ourselves, we as in Ronald Shea, the British, are themselves descended. Seeing the land that it was good, they poured down upon it, pushing before them or subduing the more primitive people they found already in possession. And so that sets up, in the third decade of the 20th century, we still have this notion of a super race that comes and subjugates and silences and proceeds to dismantle previous inhabitants, more primitive ones. So the nature of indigenous tradition in South Asia necessarily, I think, involves a critique of statist narratives of culture. If we want to examine colonial and post-colonial constructions of belonging and subaltern positionalities in contemporary practice, and I think we must do that before we can speak about polyphony, we must speak about who speaks, in relation to whom, from where. Another text-heavy slide, I beg your pardon, but this will not last for long. This is Adil Jasawala writing in the pages of Rishchik, a small magazine that was published out of Baroda, co-edited by Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh and Bhupen Khakar in the 1970s. In a class society such as India's, it is entirely logical that art which is considered good by the ruling class is either art which minimizes the conflict, ignores it totally, or makes that class feel that it has a pseudo-revolutionary role to play in the struggle. For many years now, it has been fashionable to paint peasants, fishermen, and Adivasis as decorative elongations in a landscape, or as melancholy and fatalistic lumps. We are familiar with these attenuated fisherwomen, blue Adivasis, and sad-eyed cowherds. We can safely hang them up in our living rooms with no fear that they might ever want to hang us. This is Jasawala writing in 72. So the entire mythology of the nation state is built out of, the tensions that are articulated between Ronald Shea and the superior race powering down from the Hindu Kush, and the blue Adivasis hanging as decorative elongations in a landscape. This is a picture that I took at the National Museum in Jakarta, which presents a map of the archipelago with paintings by Mas Pringadi of each ethnic type, a male and a female member of each ethnic type, bordering all of the islands across the archipelago. And I'm going to Indonesia specifically because, like India, it is a multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-faith civilization that is built on layers of accreted influences from various places. There are many interesting similarities and differences. The Vividhata mein ekta that we recite as our national motto is mirrored almost exactly in the Binne ka Tunggal Ika of the Indonesian nation state, unity in diversity. Strangely enough, so does the United States, e pluribus unum in Latin. So there is that sense of a kind of civilizational nation state, building of a nation state out of diversity, which necessarily involves the production of systems of communication, systems of governance, administration, and control, not entirely unlike systems of language, based in vocabularies, syntax, rules of grammar, foundational for the establishment of all communities. Written language especially, essential for state formation. The origins of scripts, as we know, are tied to administrative instrumentalities of ownership. So, the linguistic survey of India that was undertaken in at the end of the 19th century until 1928 ended up counting 364 languages extant in British India at that time. The People's Linguistic Survey of India that Professor Devi and his colleagues completed in 2012 brings that number up to 780, plus or minus. We have the tremendous example of that polyphony, that inherent chorus of 780 tongues speaking, and the task of building a national language out of that polyphony, which necessarily involves at one point a degree of abstraction, a degree of control. And I quite deliberately highlight here the work of Baij, Ramkinkar Baij, the great master of Shantiniketan, the Santal family. Many of us are well familiar with this, but the notion of these heroic, larger-than-life family of Santal people who are on the move. They are on the move. They are not sitting down. They are traveling. Have they been displaced? Are they nomads? Are they of no place? How does their belonging figure in our national imagination? We may think very nicely about how the female figure has relationships formally with the great Yakshi of the Darganj. and we may think about other modernist associations in the sculpture of Ram Kinkar Baij, but I want to think more about belonging and displacement, looking at this family of this small family of Santals who are on the move, from where to where, and to what end is this move taking place. So one of the questions that I'm deeply interested in is how we can think about rootedness, like trees are rooted, and belonging, which is the formation of communities, and whether it might be useful for us to pry these apart, to think about them as not being identical. Rootedness does not equal belonging, because after all, things may take root in places where they do not belong. We have this question of belonging that sort of gets played out over and over in places, including in Indonesia. This is the work of the Chinese-born Indonesian artist Lee Man-fong, who was born in Guangzhou in old Canton in southern China, but lived and worked his professional career in Indonesia and became at one point Indonesia's national artist. And these are two examples of Lee Man-fong's paintings which both deal with quote-unquote indigenous Indonesians. The Balinese from this island paradise, and Kehidupan di Bali, Life on Bali, and the Dance of the Sea Dayaks, both looking as a sort of metropolitan artist at the lives of these indigenous peoples, the performance of everyday life, ritual, ceremony, worship, dance, the idealization of these performances of everyday life in service of a national modernist narrative. Time, very curiously, comes to a standstill. These Balinese people undertaking their ritual observances or daily marketplace activities, or these Dayaks dancing, step outside time. They step outside history. Just like we ask the question, where are the Santals coming from and to where are they going? What is their place in history, and what is their relationship with notions of belonging and displacement? It is also possible to ask a similar question about these dancing Dayaks on the right of the screen, frozen in action. The statist inscription of these individual communities, the Santals, the Dayaks, the Balinese, for them to become legible as entities within the nation state, they need to be abstracted from the actual grind. They need to be dehistoricized to a certain amount to be rendered legible. So I want to think about the work of a younger Balinese artist, Chitra Sasmita, born in 1990, who since 2019 has been working on a sort of ongoing project of drawing on ancestral knowledge and connections with human and other than human elements of the environment. This is called Timur Mera, which literally translates into the Red East. And the East is red. And she does not mean the East is red in the same way that you might hear that slogan in revolutionary China. That is not the intention of Chitra Sasmita's Timur Mera. So the East is red because Bali was won by the Dutch through extraordinary bloodshed, which most of the time we think about the Balinese as these impossibly beautiful people who are full of peace and harmony and nature and so on. But in fact, the world of Bali at one time consisted of rival kingdoms that were extremely warlike, extremely ferocious in contending with each other for superiority. that were then violently subdued by Dutch colonizers and finally pacified in the 1910s. And the defeated royal families committed mass suicide in a ritual called Puputan. Before you can take us prisoner, we shall kill ourselves. And so that entire warrior history of Bali has been then rewritten within first the Dutch colonial narrative and then within the Republican Indonesian narrative through a deliberate cultural policy of erasure, which is called Bali searing. The Bali was produced into the island of the gods. So cultural transmission then becomes a question for someone like Chitra Sasmita of excavating the archive. And the archive is not easily excavated because it is either controlled by the masculine patriarchal authority or consigned to statist narratives of Balinese exoticism. The process of resuscitation that Chitra Sasmita has undertaken over the last 7 years or so has been painstaking. It is an epistemological excavation using various versions of the tale of Panji, the Kakawin, other myths and legends, reconstructing the mythic as a living force and trying to re-articulate a gynocentric perspective of resistant epistemes through these excavations. Human presences in her work, specifically female ones, are interwoven with the elements: water, earth, fire, tree, stream, river, as well as the song and the slogan, all of which emerge from the womb. The indivisibility of humans from other forms of life and phenomenal manifestations is underlined over and over again in her work, which frequently uses Kamasan canvas with these extremely densely populated, multi-layered narratives that are driven by female figures. And there is, lest we think that this is traditional Balinese art, there is in fact nothing in the Kamasan painting tradition, which has been almost entirely masculine, that looks anything remotely like this. So this is, completely new, contemporary production of a resistant epistemology, of a new kind of voice. The work of Shantibai, who's a much older artist, she was born in 1960, she's a Halbi artist from Bastar, and I want to think about these two women artists together here quite deliberately, although they are from different parts of the world and were born 30 years apart. She started her career as an assistant to her husband, of course. So she was the unnamed assistant to Raituram, who was the artist. It was only after his death that Shantibai, newly widowed, started thinking about the possibility of art practice. And strangely enough, this started in a conversation with Navjot Altaf and Bhanumati Padamsi from Mumbai, in a project that was supported by the India Foundation for the Arts, IFA, called Modes of Parallel Practice, Ways of World Making, in which Shantibai, alongside two other male artists, Kabiram and Gesuram from Bastar, started collaborating with Navjot, and they founded the Dialogue Interactive Artists Association in Kondagaon, which I've had the pleasure of visiting a couple of times. This series of Shantibais was made during the pandemic in 2020 and was shown entirely online, so it actually never did have a full gallery showing. It's a diaristic series of 20 relatively small A4 sized paintings that tell a simple story of traveling through the forest and ending up in Bailadila. Bailadila, Oxhump Hill is a mining site. Iron ore is pulled out of the earth over there. And as the journey goes from one place to the other, there is a really important story that we are able to start learning from. It's a story of how one might think about belonging. It's a story of how one might construct our relationships with the natural world around us. It's a story that is told from inside, which is manifest in notes that she gives for each of those little works, naming the trees, naming the roots, naming the flowers, naming things that are edible, naming things that are worth pausing for, the fish in the stream, the season of flowering of the palash, and so on. And so you get a sense that there is knowledge that is entirely from within an experience of having lived there, of knowing that forest inside and out, until we come here to the place where you have to pass the security entrance and enter the mine site, which now is a place of devastation, and the forest is gone, the earth has been ripped open, and there is the great machine which she describes, this one, ye patthar galane wali machine hai. So this is the machine that actually melts the rock. And so you then sort of sit down and drink tea afterwards, which is what's happening over here after having seen the Patthar Galane Wali machine. So there is an elegiac note in Shantibai's work. There is her declaration of belonging through intimate knowledge of the forest, its watercourses, plants, all the food, its resident deities, and its seasons of bloom. Whereas the landscape at Bailadila is a land in mourning, laid waste through the operations of giant earth movers. This expression of deep belonging invokes the constitutional guarantee, at least, which protects people against alienation of lands and resources. And yet it is also a guarantee that the nation state may take away at any point. There's a beautiful PDF that the gallery and the curator Chitra KS has produced, which is available at that hyperlink, which I'm happy to share with everyone. Chitra KS actually works very much in sympathy with Shantibai in producing this sense of Jal, Jungle and Zameen, the slogan that Komaram Bhim in the 1930s started to use as a way of asserting Adivasi rights for self-determination during British rule. As I come to the end, I want to speak about the work of an Inuit poet, Takralik Partridge, who was featured in the Biennale of Sydney. Alexi will remember this work, of course. It was at Artspace, and it speaks about how today it is that we see the edge of this, and how today it is that we cannot see the edge of this, the edge of the earth giving way under our feet. And so this question of belonging becomes more and more interesting, and these polyphonies articulated in different languages continue to ask questions that we find difficult to answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chaitanya. Now may I invite Venkat ji, please, along with Kamayani, to have your conversation.
Hello. Hi. First of all, thank you to Take and Bhavna and Katya for inviting me to be part of this incredible symposium. And thank you to Arshila for hosting it. I'll be honest, when I was asked to present on Jangar Singh Shyam, I wasn't sure where to begin. He's such a towering figure in modern Indian art who, in his tragically short lifetime, embodied many complex contradictions at the heart of the discourse around modernism, post-coloniality, and indigenism in independent India. And many scholars have written about it, reflected on that. The cover image is probably one of his most viewed images, even if viewers don't know who the artist is. The tiger leaping off the walls of a much frequented building, the Madhya Pradesh Vidhan Sabha. Jangar not only innovated an original style in his own practice, but single-handedly inaugurated an entire school of painting. His visual language is strikingly recognizable in the mainstream art world, in mainstream culture now. And yet, both he and his practice remain something of an enigma. In speaking about his work for an audience that could comprise both specialists, people who know him and know him very well, as well as general audiences, I wanted to stay away from the ethnographic tendency that can creep into even the most sensitive historicizing of artists from indigenous communities, especially if one is relying on secondary and tertiary sources like I am, because I did not have the privilege of having conversations with him. The more I researched, the more vexed I became. While there is so much commentary about Jangar, very little exists of his own voice in the textual archive. Jangar the artist, Jangar the thinker, remains a presence always incarnated in other people's words. Indeed, it is through those citations and footnotes that I have tried to follow in my quest for his voice. I want to start with this image rather than a photograph of Jangar by someone else. This is a photograph, this is a painting that Dr. Jyotindra Jain, who's written about him extensively, recalls, in talking about this painting, he recalls him telling him about how he used to go cattle grazing as a teenager in Patangarh. And Dr. Jain then speculates that this is possibly his only self-portrait. This is the only potential image we have of Jangar rendering himself. I do want to say that this is not really an account of Jangar's biography. Others who knew him closely, many of whom are present here, tell those stories much better. Or a detailed analysis of his practice per se, that requires a focus more suited to perhaps an art journal paper. Watch out for the sequel to this talk. What I want to share through a synopsis of his incredible career is a methodological exercise, or rather tentative notes towards a method of listening as a way to develop a decolonial, de-Brahmanical, art historical or critical writing. I attempted to listen to Jangar's voice in the most literal sense through his very rare interviews and the conversations cited by interlocutors that they committed then to print. It made me actually think, this exercise made me think of para-dubbed interviews of old films division documentaries. Para-dubbing is a process wherein the original audio track is overlaid with audio in other languages. This is a very inelegant solution to the problem of language that I've confronted also as a producer of podcasts that host artists from our third world and First Nations speaking in non-dominant languages. One example of this can be seen in our understanding of Jangar's magnificent Barasinghas, or the swamp deer, with tree branches for antlers, which are very closely associated with his work in the mainstream. In the wider sort of world, if you ask people what is the first image that they sort of can imagine when they hear his name, it's probably the Barasingha. But it's through the mode of informal conversation, decades after he made these paintings, that the fact came to light that he did not grow up seeing these animals. He first saw them only as an adult at the Kanha National Sanctuary during an artist's camp when he was already at Bharat Bhavan. So this constant delay, relay, and translation of facts, reflections, and even affective states of Jangad generates a paradubbed polyphony about his practice. Though through dialogic, relational, and ever-shifting, often asymmetrical positionalities, a body of knowledge is generated. But amidst the polyphony, it's important to remember that there is the first note, the fixed song, or what the Gregorian monks called the cantus firmus, if you will. And that is Jangar's voice. So let us move towards that. I want to take you through just some excerpts of his interviews in Hindi and in translation that I think tell something of his story in his own voice. This is an interview that he did with Yusuf, an artist, in 1985. In this extract, he sort of recalls that in his village, an elder who performed healing rituals also decorated mud walls with paintings, and a cousin of his made drawings. Watching them sparked his own practice. He emphasizes here that he never had formal training. He simply learned by observing and trying on his own. This is a Pradhan Shaman that he made in the very early 1980s. In this interview with Mark Tully, again a very rare interview from the early 90s, he talked about how he sort of started rendering the geometric abstract versions of deities, Pradhan deities, and giving them, and sort of, figuring them, imparting to them a kind of figuration. There's also a narrative canon in Jangar's later work, especially, which draws from both Pradhan myth and the bardic lore of the Pradhan Goon community. This is one such katha that he sort of renders very interestingly, compositionally. Now, in this extract, I thought what was really interesting was Mark Tully, the BBC journalist who spoke to him, sort of begins, and again, this whole interview is taking place also in translation. He sort of tells him what he had heard, the version that he had heard of Jangar's arrival at Bharat Bhavan, and Jangar corrects him. And so here you see an act of, again, speaking over that really demonstrates the importance of listening to the artist himself. I'm going to leave this up if you guys want to just read it. This is his own account of how he came to Bhopal. When asked about his palette, Jangar said he was drawn to vivid, striking colors, and using them gave him satisfaction. I'll come back to some of these. I think there are terms in these extracts that I think are very important critical categories to think about his work. Here in this interview, he talks about clean lines. And when asked, he has somebody else comment on what those clean lines mean, that there are no longer any splodges on the paper when he paints. He uses the word saf, safai, saf lakir. He also talks about his famous use of dots, especially in paintings of birds, because they suited them. Lines, meanwhile, helped him differentiate elements within the same composition, trees from birds, one form from another. So there's a logic to his use of dots and dashes that he articulates in this interview. In an interview with Seema Satyu, he actually talks about why the dot became such an important element of his visual grammar, derived from the flowers of the Parsa Jhad, which had spotted patterns. His reflection on his use of color is very interesting, because he notes here that the village pigments that he used to use were few, muted, but it was in Bhopal that he encountered bright, plentiful colors. He preferred vivid hues, what he called chatak rang, saying that they gave him satisfaction and made his paintings come alive. So he actually talks about how color is a way for him to think about animating his work. And you can see that in some of the, I'm sorry about the beheaded text. So just some examples of his use of color and sort of relating it with how he was articulating and how he was talking about his own use of color. Once again, he talks about line drawings, and it's interesting, you know, as I went through the interview, I saw that he talks about line drawings, he talks about prints, and for him there seems to be a hierarchy of things that give him joy, that give him satisfaction. So, you know, what delights him most is making paintings, and then line drawings, and then prints. And in the village, he used to make charcoal drawings as part of a wedding ritual. And when he came to Bhopal, he discovered rotring pens and rotring ink while traveling abroad in the 90s. So in this work, this is a later work, you can see a sort of drama and an irradiance that results from his use of that new material. This is the cover image again. The writer Akhilesh Ji has recounted how upset Jangad was when during this commission he was initially told by Charles Correa to copy a collage that the architect had prepared based on his prior work. And it was an incident that again we only receive in this kind of, through this relay, through this mediation. And that was emblematic of the unresolved frictions between the Indian state, the elite post-colonial cultural apparatus that he was operating in, and Adivasi subjectivity, which he was not entirely in a position to articulate in a language that would be listened to, except by his friends who would then commit that memory to art history. In 1989, Jangad was chosen to exhibit in Paris at a show called The Magicians of the Earth. You can see in the image on the left is a Pradhan deity. And this is from the catalogue of the Paris exhibition, again a very rare first-person account in which, was translated into French. It gives us deep and poignant insight into his background and creative process. He talks about the forest and the fear of gods that inspired him to paint, but then also there's this incredible line, "For me, art and life are continuous silences." And this is the kind of disclosure that is very difficult to paraphrase and paradub without that first note, without Jangad's voice, which is so resonant and plungent. On the 13th of July 2001, while at a residency at the Mithila Museum in Japan, Jangad Singh Shyam took his own life. Before his death, he wrote a letter each to his wife and mother, from which it seemed that he was depressed, isolated, and being pressured by the museum to extend his stay and create more and more work. The Quantum Commission points to a kind of industrial scale expectation, a commodification that was already happening in his lifetime. One of his paintings shown at the Magicians of the Earth exhibition, which was itself criticized by many for being primitivist and colonial, called Landscape with Spider, ended up selling for tens of thousands of dollars in 2010, widely reported as setting a record for an Adivasi artist's work. Currently, the constant conflation of Jangad's entirely original, entirely modern artistry with the misnomer of Gond art continues to prevail in order to make sales. Art market writing reflects many of the misunderstandings and strategic occlusions that his work continues to be plagued by. As a concluding exercise, let me highlight some words and phrases that Jangad used to discuss his work in his admittedly laconic disclosures. Chatak rang, or vivid colors. Mara rang ya zinda rang, meaning alive colors versus dead colors. Til milati hai aankhein, meaning his eyes dazzled when he beheld the colors. Safai or cleanliness of line, Then there are facts, such as his shamanic inspiration for becoming an artist, the dotted tree blossoms that imparted to him his pointillist style. Finally, there is his quote about the continuity between art and life, which affords a tantalizing chink unto that incredible dream world that he conjured. If we accept a co-constitutive relationship between language and knowledge, then there is perhaps an inevitable epistemic lacuna in the historiography of modern Indian art, when particular kinds of first-person voices are missing. In grammar, person refers to the relationship between speaker, listener, and subject. Within the subnational colonial caste-stratified logic of Indian modernity and modernism's narratives, perhaps we bear the onus of listening, and so that the strategy of the oral can be made subversive. If most of Jangar's works become fixed in print, a medium with a very exclusionary history in our society to begin with, via translation and transcreation, there is so much unheard and undocumented and unarchived and not engaged with. Speaking of listening, it is perhaps also important to remember that the Pradhan community's ancestral practice as bards and poets makes them makers of song, whether sonic or visual. As I realized during this research, the form of the interview offers at least one important oral mode to listen closely through trace and trail. When attending to the para-dubbed polyphonies in art historiography, we must listen closely to retrieve dat cantus firmus, the first note. And these polyphonies continue and extend his legacy through other original voices after Jangar, in the practitioners of the kalam he devised. And that is my segue to invite Venkat ji for our conversation. Thank you.